Yo, Shortbox Nation, this is Botter, and I'm here to tell you right now that con season starts early this year with the return of Northeast Florida's premier anime, comic book, and sci-fi event, Collective Con. That's right, Northeast Florida's largest pop culture convention returns for its 10th year on March 8th through the 10th at the Prime Osborne Center in Jacksonville, Florida. 10 years of Collective Con, they're pulling all the stops out to make sure this is a can't-miss event. And the guest list they got going, don't even get me started on the guest list. I mean, they've got A-list celebrity guests and voice actors from some of your favorite movies, anime, and video games like Elijah Wood and Sean Ashton, Ray Park, Trisha Helfer, Ross Marquand, Max Middleman, and Bo-Katan herself will be there, Katie Sackhoff. Tell me what other convention is giving you the opportunity to meet Frodo and Sam from Lord of the Rings, Darth Maul, and One Punch Man all under the same roof. Only at Collective Con. And if you're looking to get some of your favorite comics signed, or if you want to get an original sketch from some of the best comic artists in the world, well, you're in luck, because there'll be plenty of comic and creator guests there, like DC comic artist extraordinaire Clay Mann, Harvey Award-nominated illustrator John Taylor Christopher, Marvel and DC cover artist Chris Stevens, and acclaimed Star Wars author Timothy Zahn. They'll all be at Collective Con this year. And if you're looking to bring the family, or if you want to make a weekend out of it, you're in luck, because there'll be so much going on at Collective Con that weekend in the form of vendors, fan panels, video game tournaments, cosplay contests, after parties, and a bunch of fan events. You can purchase single and 3-day weekend passes now using the link in this episode's show notes, or by going to collectivecon.com to book your tickets and hotel. Buy your tickets now, and I'll see you at Collective Con, March 8th through the 10th. Now let's start the show.
I want this book to be a story about how you shouldn't turn people into superheroes. That's not me saying Stan was Satan incarnate or anything. That's just saying there's an image of Stan that has been constructed, and most of it's just not true.
Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the Short Box Podcast, Season 6.
Shortbox Podcast was recorded before a live internet audience.
Yo, Shortbox Nation. Welcome to episode 311. Returning listeners, welcome back. And new friends and first-timers, welcome. We're happy to have you. I'm your host, Botter Milligan, and here at the Shortbox, we like to talk about comics as well as recommend them. And when we're not doing that, we like to interview the best creators in the industry. And guess what? This week, we're joined by a distinguished guest. He's a fantastic journalist and author of the upcoming biography, True Believer, The Rise and Fall of Stan Lee. And joining me today to help with this interview is my co-host and right-hand man, Cesar Cordero. You'll hear from both of them very soon. But first, I have to shout out some people to help us keep the lights on. This episode is brought to you commercial-free by our sponsor, Gotham City Limit, Jacksonville, Florida's premier location for comics, collectibles, toys, and more. If you live in the area or ever find yourself passing through Jack's, stop by the shop on Southside Boulevard and tell them the Shortbox sent you. If you aren't already subscribed to this podcast, go ahead and do that right now. You've already made it this far. Why not stay up to date with our future interviews and episodes? We've got some cool guests and topics lined up in the coming weeks. You won't want to miss it. Lastly, this show is made possible in part by donations from our Patreon subscribers. Their contributions help us maintain and grow the show by helping us cover the cost of equipment, podcast bills, and other expenses. With that out the way, let's move on to our main event. Our guest today is a Providence-based journalist, writing primarily for New York Magazine about arts and culture, but he's also done writing, video, and audio for a bunch of other media outlets like The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, The Boston Globe, and that's just naming a few. He's here with us today to talk about his upcoming biography, True Believer, The Rise and Fall of Stan Lee. It's being published by Penguin Random House's Crown imprint and is due to be released on February 16th. Shortbox Nation, we're excited to welcome Abraham Riesman to the show. Hey, Abraham. How are you?
Hi, thanks for having me. It's very exciting.
How you doing, Abraham?
You doing good?
Doing all right, you know? Gotta keep on my grind and get this thing out the door.
Healthy, happy, family good?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I although it did just snow, and that means I have to shovel in the morning, so...
Oh. No.
Damn, and I was over here complaining about like how muggy it is outside.
Dude,
we're here in Florida, by the way.
I grew up in Maryland, and I remember my dad telling me like, "Yo, boy, you know what time it is?" And it's like, "Oh, the shovel."
No, it's time. But well, anyway, if that's my worst problem, I don't have a lot to complain about.
There you go.
That's a good perspective, Abraham. If you don't mind, if you'll spare me one moment to fanboy on record.
Oh boy.
Oh.
I would like to express my admiration for your writing.
Thank you.
You've written some of my favorite articles about comic books, but most importantly, you write about the different creators of this genre in such an interesting light. Some of my go-to articles that you've written, which I've shared with friends on multiple occasions, include the man who made Black Panther cool.
Yeah.
The creator of Doctor Strange will not see you now. And of course, one of my personal favorites, of course, keeping it topical, it's Stan Lee's universe.
Dude, I got to say, you turned me on to Abraham's articles, actually. Nice.
You're flattering me. This is very nice to hear.
No, dude, honestly. And he was like, dude, you got to get on this guy, man. He's good. He's a real shit. I was like, all right, we'll see. And then I saw one of your article titles was, I hated the new Star Wars, so I talked to my rabbi about it. And I was like, I don't think I could talk to my rabbi about Star Wars. I need to read this. Like, this is great.
Oh, man. Let me tell you, at my synagogue, that was a viral article. Everybody read that. It went out in the temple. It went out in the shul newsletter. And
great. That's great. So, yes, after Shabbat, we're going to go and we'll have a kiddush. And also, we'll be talking about Abraham's article.
Yeah, basically. No, I don't at that level. But anyway.
Well, Abraham, I was curious, what are some of your favorite comic book themed pieces that you've written? And is there any like one in particular that you feel like really encapsulate your style or voice?
Oh, wow. Let me tell you, I'm new to the world of actually being on the other end of the interview where people are asking me about my process. So every time somebody asks me something like that, I'm like, oh, I'm so flattered that you would even be interested. Well, thank you. I've been waiting my whole life to tell somebody how my process works. Let's see. You've named a few of them. One that I remain maybe it's not so much that I'm proud, more that I'm just kind of in awe that it worked out the way it did, was my profile of Steve Ditko. Like you mentioned that one, the creator of Doctor Strange Will Not See You Now. That was a really fascinating experience to report and ultimately to write. I feel like it's a piece that had an adventure kind of element to it, even though I was just sitting outside somebody's door for a few hours. It was me waiting for Steve Ditko to see if I could speak with him, since other people have done that in the past. Even though, God, sorry. Now I'm going to really go down a rabbit hole if I talk about the Steve Ditko piece.
You're in the right place to go down a Steve Ditko rabbit hole.
Okay. Well, we'll probably end up talking about him later in the conversation anyway, once we start talking about Stan. But I was very proud of that piece and was very lucky that I was able to get such interesting information from the people I interviewed, and that the experience of being there was sort of a fortuitous and dramatic and interesting thing that was pretty wild.
Can you recall your first conscious comic book experience, or the first comic book that you read and instantly made you a fan?
He's smiling.
The first real exposure I had to at least the superhero realm was not in a comic book or even in a cartoon. There was a Scholastic book fair at my elementary school. And I know you got to love those. And they were selling this I actually have it downstairs. I won't get it now, but it's this sort of little thin booklet for first grader types. That's just a handbook of Marvel characters. So I hadn't even read a Marvel comic at that point, and it was before it would be like a year or so before Batman the Animated Series and X-Men the Animated Series and the Spider-Man show all would have debuted. So I hadn't really had any exposure to any Marvel stuff, but I just completely fell down a rabbit hole of that booklet, or whatever you want to call it, and a cover drawn by Todd McFarlane. Fun fact, but it was such an interesting mythology to me. And even though I didn't really have any fixed reference points because I hadn't read any of the primary source material, there was something about how lived in this universe seemed to be that was very appealing to a young person like me. And that's something that comes up a lot in the book, is that Stan, for whatever his flaws and whatever things he did or didn't do, one thing we know is he was the guy who came up with the sort of idea of interlinking these stories and thus creating this kind of holistic, interwoven universe experience. And I felt that when I was reading the little booklet in first grade. There was just this sense of there's so much going on here. This is bigger. Like, the thing I'm holding in my hands is not the whole story. I was used to at first grade having everything be like, if you're holding a book, it's the whole story. It's, you're going to have the whole narrative, but this wasn't a narrative. It was just saying like, there's all these other narratives and they're out there. But then in sixth grade, rather, my best friend had started reading Marvel Comics, and I hadn't pulled the trigger on that, but he went there and just completely went ape shit over them. He loved them. And he was like, you have to start reading these. Like, I'll explain the stuff you don't know, but you have to start reading these. And so the first one I bought, the first Marvel comic I ever bought, was X-Men number 69. No, nice, I know. X-Men number 69, written by Scott Lobdell and drawn by Carlos Pacheco, or penciled by Pacheco. It was the end of a really bad crossover, Operation Zero Tolerance, which...
Oh my gosh, I remember.
I know. I barely remember. I mean, I remember the vague outline. I don't remember any of the specific chapters. But the point was, when I read that, it was the conclusion of Zero Tolerance. So I hadn't read any of the preceding issues. This was my complete jumping on point. So I had a rough understanding who the X-Men were from the cartoon and from the little booklet as well. But like I didn't know the specific story. So I was completely lost. And yet at the same time felt like I have to know more. And that's the trick that Stan came up with. It's genius, because it becomes an addictive substance. You once you have a little bit of it, it's only a little fragment. It's only 22, 23 pages. And then all of a sudden you're like, I need more. That's not the whole story. The whole story is elsewhere. And you never fully get to the whole story. You just get bits and pieces. And that comic was sort of the beginning of that experience for me, of going, I need to know everything about these characters, about this world, about these stories.
So that said, I was going to say, you kind of described your sort of subconscious exposure to Stan Lee and what he's contributed. What was your conscious exposure to Stan Lee?
Yeah, well, so I left out the Stan Lee part of that, which was, I first became aware of Stan Lee, as is true for a lot of millennials, I imagine, through the other cartoon of the era, which was the least good of them, probably, Marvel Action Hour, right? Yeah, Marvel Action Hour, which does not hold up that well. And I interviewed the guy who wrote the first season, and he was like, this whole thing was a complete disaster, and like it was a nightmare to put together. So Marvel Action Hour, not the best, but because his buddy was the lead writer on it, Ron Friedman, Ron made it such that Stan would do these live action intros. And what Ron told me was the whole idea behind that was because the show was like all the characters that are not Spider-Man and X-Men characters. So it would like shift back and it'd be like, here's the Iron Man, here's Hulk, here's Thor, whatever. He knew that like kids would not be able to have like a unified understanding of what the show was. Like, because everything else, it's like, this is the show where Spider-Man shows up every time that I watch it, or the X-Men show up every time that I watch it. But with the other show, you didn't have any, with Marvel Action Hour, you didn't have anything to grab onto. It'd be like, if I turn it on, I'm rolling the dice, and maybe it's a character I like, maybe it's a character I don't. But what could link the whole thing together would be every episode would have Stan. Right. Stan would be a character in every episode. Even if it wasn't for that long, and he wasn't the star of the whole thing or anything, having him as this unifying factor was a real priority, and it worked on me. That was how I never fell into like Stan Lee fandom adulation, but like I was very aware of him at that point. Oh, and also from Wizard, of course. Wizard, the comics magazine, had a lot of Stan content. So I was aware of him, but didn't have like a particular relationship with him. But he was a figure that loomed large in the comics and Marvel and superhero world. And he is somebody, that you kind of can't not see. He's the figure for mainstream culture and for comics culture.
Well said. And since we're on, since we arrived at the topic of Stan Lee, for our listeners who are just being introduced to you and your body of work for the first time, in your words, Abraham, could you introduce and tell our audience what the book True Believer, The Rise and Fall?
Sure, yes. Oh, I'm sorry. I went off the rails there. But so I've written this book, True Believer, The Rise and Fall of Stan Lee. It's coming out, as you said, from Crown, and it is a biography of Stan. It was what you might call unauthorized. It was independent. I had nothing to do with the Lee estate, such as it is. It's a whole story about what the Lee estate consists of right now. But, this was me doing an independent investigation and historical dive. It's a revealing biography, I would say. I didn't set out to write a hatchet job, nor do I think it is. I try to present as many perspectives on Stan as I could find. And it's a full chronicle of his life. It starts in 19th century Romania, where his parents were born. And it ends in Los Angeles in the bird streets of Beverly Hills in 2018 when Stan passed away. And I tried to fill out a story that's coherent while also being honest. And I guess I'll let readers be the judge whether I pulled that off.
I wanted to take a step back. In the overture of the book, you write, "The man's journey adds up to one of the more fascinating stories of the past century of American arts and letters, and it is a journey that has heretofore gone unexamined in public. The time has come to tell that story." I was curious, did you have a specific goal in mind when writing the biography, or a contribution that you wanted to offer when it came to the story of Stan Lee as a whole?
To clarify what I was saying in that passage, there have been other biographies of Stan Lee. I stand on the shoulders of giants. There's a lot of really good stuff that has been written, but most of them had not been, some of them had not been written until well before Stan passed away. So there was a lot of stuff that it just hadn't happened yet. Or there were books that just weren't really interested in that for whatever value of those books. They just weren't interested in looking at stuff that was not already somewhat well known. Mm-hmm. And what I wanted to do was tell a full holistic story of Stan to the best of my ability. And that is something where I want this book to be a story about how you shouldn't turn people into superheroes. That's not me saying Stan was Satan incarnate or anything. That's just saying there's an image of Stan that has been constructed by Stan himself, by Marvel, by the fandom, by any number of corporate entities that he's been involved with. And most of it's just not true. I mean, the story he told about his life was largely false. A lot of the twists and turns along the way, he completely mischaracterized. And it adds up to, what he was, his life story, what he was presenting as his life story. It added up to a really fascinating tale that has really gripped a lot of people and, made them have real affection and relationship when it comes to Stan. Without setting out to ruin anybody's lives, I just feel like we have a tendency as humans to look at people we like and make them out to be something they aren't.
Right.
And I just think that's a dangerous way to approach reality and to approach celebrity and to approach the arts. It's just, Stan was a person and he had a lot of, weaknesses maybe, and that's just something that unfortunately we have to live with about ourselves and about everyone that we know. And if I had a goal there, I think it was to try and keep people honest about, how we approach the people we love.
Well, you have these, you kind of set some stuff up where it's like Macbeth, Charles Foster Kane, Moses.
Yeah.
Stan Lee.
Stan Lee, right.
Like, what do all those dudes have to do with each other?
There are different facets of him that I'm going with when I make the allusions. But the thing that I picked for the epigraph, I'm not saying he's Macbeth in terms of, being
deeds,
Macbeth.
right?
Yeah, but the Stan story, but also Macbeth, is a story about ambition, of going. It's what happens when you let ambition be your primary driver.
Right.
If you're letting the desire for more, for a higher status, for whatever, if that's the main thing that is lighting a fire under you, it's dangerous.
Sure.
You oftentimes, if you run into obstacles there, if you're not being driven by other forces as well, you might make compromises. And again, we're all susceptible to that sort of thing, but
Yo, this is Botter. Sorry for interrupting this episode, but I'll keep it brief. I wanted to let you know about a massive sale we have going on over at the Shortbox store on all of our merchandise and apparel. That's theshortboxstore.bigcartel.com. You can now save 20% off your entire order using the discount code YOO, Y-O-O. So if you've been waiting for the right time to finally buy that gauntlet snapback, or if you ever wanted to buy any of the shirts you see me wear on the podcast, well, now's your chance to get them for a steal. We still have a few sizes left of everything, but they won't last long, and once they're gone, they are gone. And then I mentioned that all of our apparel is screen printed on high quality material. None of that heat transfer or direct to garment stuff. Our shirts are some of the most comfortable ones you'll ever wear, and the hats look even better in person. So wear your support for the Shortbox Nation proudly, knowing that you're going to look damn good doing it. Get to theshortboxstore.bigcartel.com as soon as you can, and don't forget to use that discount code YOO, Y-O-O, to save 20% off your entire order. All of this information can be found in this episode's show notes if you want to get there faster. Thanks for not pressing fast forward. Now back to the show.
Well, this book tackles so many of my favorite conversations with comic know-it-alls. You know, when I go to the shop, Stan's relationship with Jack, Stan's military career, seduction of the innocent. So how do you stay focused writing the man's life when there's
so many things?
Yeah, I was about to say there's all kinds of engaging tangents to go down. I imagine you're wrestling with smoke the whole time.
The main trick I had was, for some stretches of, I tried to have every chapter cover about the same amount of story, which is not the same amount of time necessarily. Because there were times in Stan's life where it really pays off to do a minute by minute practically, you know, or at least month by month, looking at something like taking a year or 2 years or 4 years and looking at like, here's all the beats that happened. At the beginning of the process, like right when I got the contract, I talked to Sean Howe, who wrote Marvel Comics The Untold Story.
I was just talking to you about it.
Yep.
Right. He was sort of the guy who inspired me to start writing comics journalism in a serious way. And he was like, the one thing to remember is it's not an encyclopedia. Like, you don't need to have every single topic in Stan's life covered. You don't have to have every single event in Stan's life covered. You want to tell a story that is true, complete, and gets the job done. You don't need to have every detail in there. And so, yeah, I tried to balance everything kind of by thinking about it in those terms, where it's like there's kind of some chapters are this CD sped up version where it's like skipping, like it sounds, you know, but you can still hear the melody. And then other times I'm like,
Abraham, I'm going to tell you right now, as I was reading, I felt like it was like I was going through the Zapruder film and I've got like a cigarette in my hand and I'm just like, this goes all the way to the top, you know, like just enjoying myself.
I guess. Yeah.
No, it's good. And I guess the picture I'm trying to paint is you're getting a bunch of, you're getting every side. And I think the best way to describe it, as far as my experience, is humble, honest, and fun.
Emphasis on the honest.
Yeah. Like I was like, this is a really legit take. Like
thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm for real, man. Like it was good.
Yeah, that's all you can do. I mean, I feel like there's sort of a, you know, I was very careful when it came to quoting everybody here, in no small part because there are a lot of litigious characters who pop up in the course of the book. So, you know, just to be careful, I made sure that everything was, you know, real precise. Right. And also just because it's, I mean, not like I don't do that with other stuff, but you kind of dial it up even more because it's going to be a hard copy that'll live in an archive somewhere. You can't go edit it online or, you know, whatever. It's something that will pop up in somebody's library, hopefully, you know, even if it's just one person 200 years from now. You want it to be as accurate, complete, and honest a work as you can, because people are going to be looking for the story of Stan Lee in whenever in the future.
Right.
I feel like it's my responsibility to not mislead them. If for no other reason than I know what it's like to, as somebody who was researching him and researching the past and comics history, I get very frustrated when people did not present complete or accurate reports of stuff, because that means future generations, posterity, history, whatever, doesn't have access to that information. It just feels like a dereliction of duty. So anyway, thank you. I appreciate that, is what I'm trying to say.
Abraham, I wanted to go back to what you were talking about as far as like some of the individuals and the characters that you interviewed for this book. Because I read in the solicitation that you conducted more than 150 interviews and investigated thousands of pages of private documents about Lee's life and works. Who are some of the more notable people that you interviewed for this book? There
were a few interviews that really form the pillars of the book. The big one was I had long chats with Larry Lieber, Stan's brother, who is still around, lives in a studio apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan that he's lived in since 1968. I presume it's rent controlled because he has virtually no money. And he and Stan had a very difficult relationship. It's complicated. It's not as simple as like, we didn't have a relationship. In fact, they, for God's sake, Larry was drawing the Spider-Man newspaper strip for decades. Not that Stan was really writing it. He was ghostwriting it, but he would call Larry just to say, he'd call Larry with edits. He continued to do that even when other people were writing the strip. And, Larry would talk about how like, that was the only time I ever talked to him during that period. Like all he did was have this professional relationship, and it was a recurring one, but they didn't have any personal relationship. And, the Stan Larry relationship and the Stan and his parents' relationship were things that I really would not have been able to understand without Larry being very generous with his time and his stories. So that was a really key building block. Another was I had, upwards of, I think like 11 hours of interview with, over the course of a number of occasions with Peter Paul, Stan's business partner from Stan Lee Media, who was also very, like I said, it was 11 hours. He was very generous with his time and gave me a lot of information that is very hard to fact check and, outlandish. He would claim that he just has a life that happens to have been outlandish, and I will leave it to the reader to judge whether you think it's on the level or not. But that was really important because he had a very close relationship with Stan. They were best friends and business partners. And what happened at Stan Lee Media really defines Stan's later life in a lot of ways. Let's see, another one would have been, there were ones that were shorter, but really just fascinating. Like, another long one, Jim Shooter, the former editor-in-chief of Marvel. I talked to Jim for a number of hours. He has these giant albums, just these big photo albums full of Stan-related stuff. He really loved Stan. And Stan was sort of the last person in comics that really would have a relationship with Jim. Jim has had a rocky go of it and has burned a lot of bridges. He'd be the first to tell you. But Stan and he still remained very affectionate to almost the end.
I was going to say, as far as getting all this information, I know at the end of your journey, you end up thanking people and not, you're like, look, it's a cliche that this doesn't all happen without a team of researchers. You had people that helped you. And I'm wondering, were some of these people that you had help, were some of them comic book heads and some of them not? Like, what was the ratio? That's
a really good question. I actually did not have, it depends. A lot of people helped me out on this book. When it comes to the actual research, I had some research assistants to do. I was lucky that I had a nice, generous advance from Penguin Random House, so I was able to hire research assistants to do transcription, which was useful. That just saves a hell of a lot of time.
Sure.
But they were doing other research as well. And now that I think about it, one of them was a comics geek.
There you go.
And one of them knows comics, but doesn't have that deep of a sort of Marvel superhero knowledge. She actually makes comics herself. She's very talented. So some of them were heads. but it didn't come up all that often. That said, when it comes to people who read it after I was done with the manuscript and wanted to run it by people for, fact checking and to just see whether I got it right, there I I got to work with some really expert people. There's this guy, Patrick Ford, who runs this Facebook group about Kirby and Stan, and just has this encyclopedic knowledge of the Kirby Stan dispute. Wow. And, I asked him to read the manuscript, and he did, and he was enormously helpful. And having his seal of approval was something that meant a lot to me because he really knows his stuff and is also pretty merciless. He, does not hesitate to criticize deeply people who are over affectionate towards Stan. Other people read it to have the perspective of somebody who has no interest in comics, because I wanted to reach out to people who just like literary nonfiction, because I think it's a pretty universally interesting story. And you don't have to have prior knowledge about Stan in order to read this book, or at least that's what I was going for. I wanted it to be, expert enough. I was trying to thread the needle of being expert enough that the heads will be on board with it and will actually find out new stuff in it that they didn't already know, but also have it not be so deep in the weeds that a lay reader can't get into it. So we'll see with the readership whether that worked, but I worked hard to try and find that balance.
What was maybe like the most notable like new thing that you learned that maybe came as a surprise, or just like
personally what I found most interesting in terms of stuff that hadn't been told before was, like I said, the Jewish stuff, Stan's family and ancestry, and his relationship with his parents and his brother really captivated me in the research. And I'm very proud that there is stuff in there that just wasn't known. I mean, most of it. I mean, Larry hadn't talked about it. Stan certainly never talked about any of it. And it's that's not so much shocking as just fascinating and sad at times. Both of his parents died tragically, and Stan never really acknowledged it in public at all, or really much in private. It just didn't come up. But there were sad endings for Jack and Celia. And anyway, and then there's the stuff that's just on a lighter note. I loved getting backstories for stuff like Stripperella, like Stripperella, that story had not really been told before. And I tracked down the showrunners, and we had a nice chat about that. I had an email interview with her. I did not get to talk to her in person, but we did trade some questions and answers over email. My favorite, she gave a great quote, which was, she loved working with Stan, and she said, we only had one dispute. Stan wanted nudity, I didn't. And I just love that detail. That was, it says a lot. You learn a lot about him when you look at the failed projects. But anyway, go ahead.
Abraham, could you summarize, I guess, in a few words, based on your findings? I mean, you're the man that did all the research. So I'm curious, what do you feel is the strongest and maybe most precise contributions that Stan Lee made to comic book culture? And at the same regard, what do you think is the most maybe exaggerated or inaccurate claim?
Sure, yeah. Well, I mean, there were really three things he did that are pretty indisputable. One, he sold Marvel to the world. Jack and Ditko were not salesmen. That was not what they did. Marvel, I genuinely don't think would have taken off. It would have, even if you'd had the artistic powerhouses there, without somebody doing the brilliant marketing that he was doing, the Marvel Revolution doesn't happen. He also, within the context of the dialogue and narration that he was writing, really leveled up the way people talked. I mean, you read it now and it sounds stilted and weird and old, but at the time, even though it wasn't necessarily realist, it was a lot closer to realism than had what you'd seen in comics for the most part before. But I would say the really big thing that he contributed was the idea of the Marvel Universe, the interconnected Marvel Universe continuity. That's one thing where even Jack Kirby did not claim credit for that. They had a lot of arguments over who created what. Jack, if anything, hated that aspect of Marvel because it meant he had to worry about other people's stories when he was already spending as much time as he was spending on his own. And Stan, on the other hand, just came up with this brilliant concept that was able to make comics, like I said, this addictive substance. You know, you need more comics in order to understand even just one comic. And that idea then has become translated more recently into other franchises. And mainly just the MCU. Everybody tries to be the MCU and fails to one degree or another, but they are still aspiring to what Stan was pulled off. And it's hard to pull off, as we've learned from all these franchises that have failed at it. But when it's done well, it's a moneymaker beyond your wildest imagination. And if you want to be more generous, it's also a way to tell stories that has not existed before. I mean, there has never been a textual narrative that has lasted this long and had this many chapters. It just, it doesn't happen. And by doing this, he helped create this thing that other people have been able to manipulate to tell the kinds of stories, like Hickman. I mean, Hickman's the perfect example. You read something like Secret Wars. Secret Wars doesn't make any sense at all unless you're really steeped in this Marvel Universe continuity lore that Stan and Jack and Ditko started and that Stan synthesized and interconnected. And if you do understand that stuff, or at least have a working knowledge of it, it blows your mind because there are buttons it can hit in your brain, that continuity and interconnectedness can hit in your brain that you can't get from another kind of story.
Right.
You know, it's not the same as just watching sequels or prequels or whatever. It's these tendrils going off in a million directions. And you try to sort of unfocus your eye and look at the magic eye poster, you know, and once you can see that image, it's amazing. And that is something Stan can really take credit for.
Right. You feel like you earned the payoffs.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, and the exaggerated part. Well, you know, this is going to sound obvious, but it's creative credit. I mean, there's a lot you'll see in the book. There's a lot of demonstrable, just clear cut, he lied about creative credit stuff. And there's the stuff that's more debatable and therefore more frustrating because we'll probably never have an answer, which is who created the characters themselves as opposed to the individual issues. And, you know, it's really hard to determine who did what, but we can definitely say that Stan exaggerated stuff and had a version of events that he sort of walked back later when he started calling his collaborators co-creators. But for a long time, he was just calling himself the creator and thinking of himself. And he still thought of himself as the creator, even after he started giving that little designation of co-creator to Ditko and Kirby. But yeah, so creative credit is definitely inflated and you got to be careful about that.
Do you think writing this book had a profound, or has it had a profound or specific impact on your thoughts and opinions on like the comic and book industry?
Sure. Yeah. Well, it really puts into stark relief how shitty it is. I mean, you know, when you actually learn the history of how comics companies have operated, including Marvel, you just keep getting struck over and over again by the fact that they're unbelievably poor to laborers. I mean, the labor rights barely exists in comics and certainly didn't exist decades and decades ago. You know, it's completely mind-bogglingly stupid and unfair that creators who come up with these characters don't own the characters. There's no justification for that. No claim on this stuff. At best, you can hope for, you know, Marvel doing what they often do, which is they'll sort of toss a bone to somebody who created a character that now is the star of $1 billion movie. They'll say, okay, well, we'll toss you a chunk of change. And it's usually a substantial one. People are happy to get it, but that's not the same as ownership. That's just having a corporation take mercy on you and not wanting you to complain to the press. And it's just bad. That's not how an industry should work or be built. And I don't feel any discomfort saying that. I will say that till the end of, I don't think that's a biased or partisan thing to say. It's just people who work hard should be remunerated and given the ownership that they deserve.
You know what it made me appreciate, though? You know, the pages and the chapters I was able to get into this book, it made me appreciate the boys at Image, the story of Image Comics.
Right.
And those, what was it, 7, right? Seven original founders?
Sure. Number changed a little bit, but yes.
Yeah, exactly. But it made me appreciate how much just tenacity they had to take their own careers into their hand. Like they were not going to be a repeat of, of their,
the older
ancestors.
generation.
Yes,
yeah.
thank you.
Like you and I were talking about that. Like we were like, yo, you wonder if these old guys were looking at those dudes thinking, damn, like
go boys,
they're still
go
friends.
boys.
Shit.
Yeah, well, I mean, some of the, Claremont was initially with them and then sort of fell out with it for various reasons. But, that's a longstanding tradition of people who are not the indie creators sort of looking on and grumbling. I mean, I have a story of that in the book, which is there was this underground comics or quote unquote underground comic back in the underground comics days of the late 60s, early 70s that Marvel put out with this underground publisher, Dennis Kitchen. And Kitchen, when he struck the deal with Stan, was like, look, we're going to walk if there is an ownership of this material. Like, we're not taking the Marvel deal. This is not going to be that. And Stan, there were negotiations over it, but that part Stan agreed to. And the old timers, or at least the people who were not in the underground world, were heard about the fact that this was happening, that this other deal existed. And they were furious. I mean, can you imagine? Like you've just sort of accepted that this is the status quo, and then suddenly Stan is making an exception for somebody. That must have been infuriating. The Image has its problems, but like the idea of trying to assert ownership and assert that labor should be, compensated fairly. That's something that nobody else really had done since the underground days. Well, there were a few exceptions, but yes, the Image guys set an example that I think is something that's worth studying, and they were shooting in the right direction.
Absolutely. Abraham, I want to go ahead and shift gears, man, and get something a little more lighthearted and kind of put the focus back on you before we wrap up. I was curious, what's it like writing for comics in a journalistic capacity?
Oh, it's the great joy of my life. I mean, I'm really lucky. I'm the luckiest guy. If you told me in 2002 that when I was an adult, I'd be able to write multiple critical pieces about like Ultimates and the Ultimate Marvel experiment, I would have laughed in your face. But like when a generation gets older, all of a sudden the stuff that they had once loved when they were younger, they now have the wherewithal to write about or make stuff about or be inspired by in the stuff that they create, and people will pay attention because all of a sudden the rest of us, our ears perk up and we go, oh, I thought I was the only one who thought about that. Or I thought that was just me and my friends that cared about that thing when we were growing up. Right. And that happens with every generation. But I feel like I was lucky that I was around writing about this stuff at a time when other millennials were having that realization. And so, when I would write about Ultimate Marvel, or I would write about, Old Man Logan or whatever, I would have this opportunity to speak to people who had similar enthusiasms and memories. And then also to be allowed to write for this mainstream audience where if I played my cards right, people would be looking at it who didn't have any prior affinity for this material. That's the hardest part about the job. And I'm lucky that that's the hardest part, but it's balancing between the audiences of the heads and the lay people. Right. And it took a long time for me to figure out how to do that. And I hope I pulled it off in the book.
So that said, now companion question to what you asked, Butter.
Yes.
Have you ever wanted to try your hand at writing or drawing a comic book?
Sure. My big dream is, and maybe I'll do it in fan fiction form someday, is writing the most Jewish Magneto story that's ever been written. That's my dream. I just want to write
Don't you have a companion article? What is it? How Magneto became Jewish or something?
I'm trying to figure out what that looks like.
Yeah, well, I mean, Magneto is the ultimate bad Jew. As a fellow bad Jew, I look at him and, well, this is the thing. This is I wrote an article about Harley Quinn, and I interviewed a lot of women who were like, the reason that Harley really resonates with me is she's the one female character that's allowed to be just a complete dick and be just a terrible person. usually when female characters are getting portrayed, it's like men writing them and going like, well, she has to be super virtuous, or like she's kind of sassy. And like similarly with Jewish characters, usually they're like handled with some degree of kid gloves, or their Jewishness just doesn't come up, you know,
Right.
you just don't mention it because it's too weird to talk about. But Magneto, you cannot avoid that he is Jewish as shit. They are like down on record with that. His whole thing is that he's this angry, vengeful, pissed off Jew who like he's better than everybody else. And I love that. It's such a great idea. And so few comics have actually dared to really get into the Jewish aspects of it, which is fair because it might be bad PR, but that means like all the more opportunity for me to just tick people off. I don't know. Other than that, I write articles in the interim. So, if you go to abrahamriesman.com, you can see links to anything and everything. And, so I write about this and that on in between working on the book.
Cool. And you're also a fantastic Twitter follow, by the way.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yes, Twitter.com/Abraham Joseph. You're in for a ride.
Well, Abraham, it has been an absolute pleasure.
It's a treat, man.
To have you on the show to talk about the book. I want to reiterate.
This was a lot of fun. You guys are good interviewers. I appreciate it.
Thank you kindly. I cannot wait to go ahead and wear that credit. Yeah, that's going to be a drop on the short box. I'm going to isolate that.
Abraham Riesman, and I'm telling you, they're great interviewers.
Oh, man. Listeners, look. Buy this man's book. Seriously. True Believer.
Oh, thank you. True Believer, The Rise and Fall of Stan Lee. Yes.
Right on.
I hope you enjoy the rest of it. And and listeners, thank you for listening.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Abraham.
All right. Thanks, Abraham.
Peace. Yep. Listeners, you have now reached the end of the show. Hopefully you've got a copy of Abraham's book, True Believer, The Rise and Fall of Stan Lee, in your shopping carts right now. But kudos to those of you who already had it pre-ordered going in. The episode may be over, but the convo doesn't have to stop there. Now it's your turn to chime in and tell us what you thought about this episode. Feel free to share your thoughts on the conversation, or champion your favorite comic. Give us something to read next episode by sending a short email to our inbox at theshortboxjacks@gmail.com, or hit us up on social media. On behalf of the crew, I'm extending my appreciation to our sponsor, Gotham City Limit, and our Patreon subscribers for helping us keep the lights on. If you enjoyed the podcast and you're in a position to contribute $1 or $2 to help us keep this thing going, consider becoming a Patreon subscriber. In exchange for your contributions, we'll reward you with bonus episodes and other cool perks. Visit patreon.com/theshortbox for more information. Thanks again for tuning in this week, and if you decide to come back next week, we'll be talking about the 2005 Marvel Comics series Young Avengers, written by Alan Heinberg and illustrated by Jim Chung. Make sure you're subscribed to the show and stay tuned to the podcast feed, and don't forget to follow us on social media for anything else we come up with. In the meantime, have a great week, everyone, and please continue to make mine and yours Shortbox and keep it geeky.